In June 1941, the Soviet Union faced the largest invasion in history. Adolf Hitler's Operation Barbarossa caught the Red Army partly unprepared, and the sheer scale of the attack forced the Soviet government into urgent and unprecedented measures to mobilize millions of soldiers. The survival of the Soviet state was at stake. Every man of fighting age became a potential soldier, and the process of choosing who would fight was a complex mix of bureaucracy, urgency, and political control. The Soviet Union had a highly centralized system. Every town, village, and city maintained detailed records of its citizens, including age, health, and political reliability. This system, developed over years of Communist Party governance, allowed the government to mobilize soldiers quickly. Local military offices, called Wohnkomats, were responsible for overseeing recruitment. They had lists of eligible men, often classified by age brackets. Initially, the target was men aged 18 to 45, but as casualties mounted, younger teenagers and older men were also drafted. At the same time, political loyalty was as important as physical fitness. Stalin's government feared that some citizens might collaborate with the Germans or refuse to fight. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, monitored citizens to ensure loyalty. Men with suspicious backgrounds, those whose families had been labeled enemies of the state, or anyone with connections abroad were scrutinized closely. In some cases, loyalty or re-education was tested in military service itself, with dangerous assignments often given to those whose loyalty was in doubt. The scale of the recruitment effort was staggering. Millions of men were taken from factories, farms, universities, and even recently liberated territories. Entire communities were affected, and the draft notices arrived without warning. Families often had no time to prepare. Many men were simply instructed to report to the nearest military office or boarding train to reach the front. The draft process began at the Wohnkomats, where men were physically examined and registered. Physical fitness was evaluated quickly, usually in less than 10 minutes. A doctor would check the heart, lungs, muscles, and overall stamina. Those with serious illnesses were sometimes excused, but the army could be lenient if the man was otherwise strong. The Red Army needed soldiers more than perfection. Political reliability was equally important. Men were interviewed and officials reviewed their personal files. Men from politically suspect families were often assigned to frontline units as a test of loyalty. Many soldiers did not survive these postings, making survival itself a mark of reliability. During the worst years of the war, selection was no longer just about health or loyalty. The Red Army became desperate for numbers. Boys as young as 16 and men as old as 55 were drafted. Some local officers were even instructed to take anyone capable of carrying a weapon. Entire villages could be emptied of their male population overnight. The Soviet system also accounted for specialization. Men with prior technical skills, such as engineers, mechanics, or drivers, were often sent to artillery units or tank divisions. Farmers and laborers could be sent to infantry units. However, in the chaos of war, these assignments were sometimes ignored, and men were thrown directly to the front with minimal training. Once chosen, soldiers were transported to training or directly to the front lines. Trains were crowded, often standing room only. Food was scarce and medical care was minimal. Soldiers sometimes traveled hundreds of miles under harsh conditions. Basic training was intense but extremely short. Depending on the urgency of the front, some recruits received just a few days of instruction. Training included rifle handling, grenade throwing, marching, and basic trench construction. Many recruits learned in real combat situations once they arrived at the front. Instructors were often harsh, using fear as motivation. Discipline was strict because failure to follow orders could mean death, either from the enemy or from internal military police. Soldiers were trained to obey, march, and fight without hesitation. Upon arrival, soldiers were assigned to units based on need rather than personal skills. The Red Army's doctrine emphasized massed manpower to absorb the enemy's advance. Infantry units were often sent into dangerous zones with high casualty expectations. Those deemed loyal but expendable might be placed in shock units, which were tasked with the hardest missions. The Soviet command issued Order Number 227, known as Not One Step Back, which meant retreat was forbidden. Soldiers who attempted to retreat could face execution by their own side. Behind the lines, NKVD detachments monitored the front to prevent desertion, creating an additional layer of fear. Despite the harsh conditions, camaraderie developed among soldiers. Men shared rations, water, and kept each other alive in freezing winters and under artillery fire. Survival often depended on teamwork, quick thinking, and endurance. Specialized roles became critical as the war continued. Some men were selected for sniping units, tank crews, or artillery divisions based on skill or aptitude. Women were also recruited, serving as medics, pilots, and communication specialists, showing that the Soviet Union's manpower strategy extended beyond traditional norms. The inclusion of women in combat roles was unprecedented and vital to the Soviet war effort. The psychological pressure on these soldiers was immense. They were aware that retreat could mean execution, failure could mean shame, and death was a daily reality. Political indoctrination continued even on the front, reinforcing loyalty and the idea that the survival of the Soviet Union depended on their personal courage. Casualties were staggering. Millions of Soviet soldiers died in the first years of the war, making the process of selection a brutal cycle of replacement. Survivors often became instructors, passing experience to the next wave of recruits. The harshness of the selection process paradoxically strengthened the Red Army, creating a cadre of soldiers who were disciplined, resilient, and capable of enduring extreme hardship. The impact on Soviet society was profound. Families were permanently altered, villages emptied of men, and the fabric of communities changed forever. Yet the system allowed the Soviet Union to maintain a continuous supply of manpower, eventually stabilizing the front and turning the tide against Hitler's forces. Through careful monitoring, strict discipline, and sheer necessity, the Soviet Union transformed ordinary men and women into an army capable of resisting and ultimately defeating one of the most powerful militaries of the time. The soldiers who were chosen, trained, and sent to fight were not heroes because they volunteered, but because they endured unimaginable conditions, followed harsh orders, and contributed to the defense and survival of their nation. Today, the story of how Soviet soldiers were chosen stands as a testament to both the horrors and resilience of war. It shows the human cost of survival, the role of state control in shaping an army, and the extraordinary endurance of ordinary people under the most extreme conditions. The soldiers of the Soviet Union were selected not just to fight, but to embody the will of a nation under siege, and their sacrifices remain a central chapter in the history of World War II. In the early months of the war, the Red Army faced devastation. Entire divisions were encircled and destroyed, leaving behind only fragments of soldiers to carry on. The selection process became even more urgent as Soviet losses mounted at an almost unimaginable scale. Men were drafted in waves, often before the previous group had even reached the battlefield. The government issued directives to increase the recruitment quotas, and local officials were held accountable for meeting these numbers. Failure to provide the required soldiers could result in imprisonment or execution, creating an atmosphere of fear and extreme efficiency at every level of the mobilization system. The journey to the front was itself a trial by fire. Recruits were loaded onto overcrowded trains with insufficient food, water, or medical attention. Many suffered from frostbite or exhaustion during long journeys in winter, or heat stroke in summer. Some trains were bombed or shelled by the Luftwaffe, leaving survivors to continue on foot for miles. It was not uncommon for soldiers to arrive at their deployment locations already weakened, malnourished, and sick, yet they were immediately expected to perform at full capacity. Once at the front, soldiers encountered the harshest conditions imaginable. The Soviet Union's geography presented extreme challenges. Frozen plains in the north, muddy fields in the west, dense forests in the east. Winter warfare was particularly brutal. Temperatures often fell below -30 degrees Celsius, and many soldiers were sent into combat with inadequate clothing or boots, leading to frostbite and even death before encountering the enemy. Yet despite these conditions, soldiers pressed on, driven by both survival instincts and the belief that the defense of their homeland was paramount. Basic training provided only the barest skills needed for survival. Soldiers learned how to handle rifles, bayonets, and grenades, but advanced tactics were often learned on the battlefield itself. Experienced soldiers who survived early battles were invaluable for passing on knowledge, but the turnover rate was devastatingly high. Units were frequently replenished with new recruits who had never seen combat, creating a cycle of learning under fire that defined much of the Red Army's early wartime experience. Political indoctrination accompanied physical training. Soldiers were constantly reminded that their actions represented not only their own survival but the survival of the Soviet Union and the communist ideology. Propaganda emphasized heroism, loyalty, and sacrifice, and soldiers were encouraged to view themselves as part of a larger historical struggle against fascism. Loyalty checks continued even at the front lines. Officers were instructed to monitor morale and report any signs of dissent or defeatism. This dual focus on physical capability and ideological reliability defined the Soviet approach to soldier selection. Despite the hardships, camaraderie developed rapidly among recruits. Shared experiences of hunger, cold, fear, and the constant threat of death forged bonds that were often stronger than those found in peacetime. Soldiers relied on each other for survival, sharing rations, medical aid, and even shelter in freezing trenches. Letters from home were rare, and news from the wider war front was sporadic, making the support of comrades a critical lifeline. Many men endured injuries or illness to protect their fellow soldiers, understanding that the survival of one often depended on the survival of the group. Women played a crucial role in the Soviet war effort. Tens of thousands were selected for combat and support roles. Women served as snipers, medics, pilots, communications officers, and in anti-aircraft units. The selection process for women emphasized both skill and ideological reliability, and they were integrated into frontline operations in unprecedented numbers. Their contributions were vital, both in terms of combat effectiveness and in sustaining the morale of male soldiers. The psychological pressure on Soviet soldiers was immense. They faced not only the enemy but the constant presence of their own state's enforcement mechanisms. NKVD units patrolled the rear areas to prevent desertion and ensure compliance with orders. Soldiers were aware that failure to obey could result in execution, and this knowledge added a constant layer of tension. At the same time, the Soviet command sought to maintain morale through propaganda, emphasizing heroic deeds, commemorating fallen comrades, and promising that the sacrifices of today would ensure victory for the future. Casualty statistics were staggering. In the first year of the war alone, millions of Soviet soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The selection process had to be relentless to maintain the army's fighting capacity. Replacements were drawn from every corner of the Soviet Union, including remote villages, urban centers, and newly liberated territories. The Red Army's ability to replenish its ranks under such conditions was a remarkable logistical achievement, reflecting both the organizational strength of the Soviet state and the extraordinary endurance of its people. Logistics played a critical role in the selection and deployment of soldiers. Rail networks were used extensively to move recruits, equipment, and supplies across vast distances. Soldiers often traveled hundreds or even thousands of kilometers to reach the front, and coordination between local military offices, regional commands, and the central government was essential. Supply shortages, damaged infrastructure, and enemy attacks added layers of complexity, but the system managed to keep millions of soldiers moving toward combat zones. The impact on Soviet society was profound. Entire communities were emptied of men, leaving behind women, children, and the elderly to maintain farms, factories, and daily life. The psychological toll was immense. Families lived with constant fear for the lives of their loved ones, and the knowledge that many would not return shaped every aspect of civilian life. Yet the population understood that survival depended on the collective effort, and this understanding fueled both compliance with conscription and extraordinary resilience. As the war progressed, the Red Army adapted its selection processes. Lessons learned from early defeats led to more structured training programs, improved coordination between units, and the development of specialized schools for officers and technical experts. Soldiers who survived the early battles became instructors, mentors, and leaders, ensuring that the knowledge gained under fire was passed on to new recruits. The combination of harsh selection, rapid training, and experiential learning under combat conditions gradually transformed the Red Army into a highly effective fighting force. Battles such as Stalingrad, Kursk, and Leningrad illustrated the effectiveness of this system. Soldiers who had been selected under extreme conditions demonstrated extraordinary resilience, discipline, and tactical skill. The mass mobilization of men and women, combined with ideological indoctrination and rigorous enforcement of orders, allowed the Soviet Union to absorb initial losses and eventually mount counteroffensives that pushed back the German army. The experience of survival shaped the soldiers in profound ways. Many who lived through the war spoke of camaraderie, perseverance, and the determination to protect their homeland. These were ordinary people chosen under extraordinary circumstances, transformed by necessity into an army capable of facing one of the most formidable militaries in history. The sacrifices of these soldiers were immense, but their endurance ensured that the Soviet Union remained a central player in the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany. Even after victory, the process of soldier selection during the war left lasting effects on the Soviet military and society. Veterans returned home with experiences that influenced military doctrine, community leadership, and national identity. The Red Army's emphasis on resilience, discipline, and ideological loyalty became defining characteristics for generations of soldiers that followed. The story of how Soviet soldiers were chosen is therefore not just a story of conscription, but of survival, resilience, and national determination. It highlights the interplay of bureaucracy, political oversight, and human endurance in shaping an army capable of resisting and ultimately defeating an invader of unprecedented power. The soldiers were not chosen because they volunteered, but because the survival of the nation demanded it. They endured fear, hunger, exhaustion, and death, and their sacrifices remain a central part of the history of World War II. The system of selection, harsh as it was, proved effective. It transformed millions of ordinary men and women into soldiers who could withstand extreme adversity, operate in challenging environments, and execute orders under intense pressure. The legacy of this selection process is reflected not only in the military successes of the Soviet Union during the war, but also in the collective memory and identity of the nation. In the end, the story of Soviet soldier selection during Hitler's invasion demonstrates the human capacity to endure, adapt, and survive under unimaginable conditions. It is a story of discipline and fear, of loyalty and sacrifice, of an entire society mobilized in the face of existential threat. The soldiers who were chosen, trained, and deployed were ordinary people shaped by extraordinary circumstances, and their actions were instrumental in the ultimate victory over one of history's most ruthless regimes. Their story continues to serve as a powerful reminder of the costs of war, the resilience of the human spirit, and the complex interplay between state, society, and the individual in times of national crisis.